Hey guys, welcome back to my YouTube channel, and today we are gonna read more puppy plays, but we're gonna get back into Barley soon after my cousin helps me fix something because my other cousin messed me up while I was in the middle of the book and I was about to finish chap the second chapter I was reading to you. So she is gonna fix it for me, and yeah. So while she fixes it, we are gonna we're going to read the puppy plays I just got for my birthday yesterday. Yesterday on my birthday, December 22nd. I really liked my birthday. Wait, today's the 23rd, right? Yeah, it is. So yesterday was my birthday, and I celebrated it on the 21st, and I stayed up until midnight. Literally, guys, I stayed up to midnight, and then when I went upstairs, it was 11:55, and then when I was laying in my bed, it turned 12 o'clock p.m. It was crazy, guys. So, guys, I hope you have a Merry Christmas. And I hope you have a terrific New Year's, too. And I hope COVID-19 will go away because it is it is the worst virus in the world. Yeah, guys. And now, guys, let's start reading this book, The Puppy Place, this special edition, Fluffy and Freckles. So, Fluffy is a sheep. I think it is a sheep. And Freckles is the dog. The adorable, cute puppy. And now, guys, let's get started with the book. And comment down below, what do you want to have for Christmas for me to do, or for your parents, from your parents. Again, let's go. Let's see. Also, remember to like, comment, and subscribe all down below. And guys, let's get started. If you haven't read all the books, I will show you when we are all the books that are in the puppy place. Don't forget to read them. Chapter 1. Charles leaned against a tree, panting. How much farther, Dad? He asked. Dad laughed. Almost there, he said. I know it's tough going with all the snow. Charles bent down to scoop up a handful of clean, fresh white snow. He bit into it, letting the cold flakes fill in his mouth and melt into a sip of water. You didn't tell me we were going on a huge hike. His father laughed again. It only feels huge the first time. You'll get used to it, and it'll be worth it. You'll see, he ruffled Charles' hair. I'm really glad you came with me, Sport. We're going to have a lot of fun. And I know Steve will be happy for the help. Plus, we'll be here for Steve's annual spring fling wing ding. His what? Charles asked. It's a big open house party Steve throws every year to celebrate maple sugaring time and the end of winter. Dad explained. It's always a blast. He started off again, and Charles followed him, plodding along on his snowshoes. It was spring break time, and Charles Peterson and his dad were on a special father-son trip together. Yesterday, the two of them had a drive for hours to get to Vermont, where an old college friend of Dad's lived. Charles had heard a lot about Steve, and he had even met him when Steve had come to visit one time, back when Charles was only a little kid, but he had never been to Steve's place in Vermont. On the way up, Dad had told Charles how Steve lived all by himself, way back in the woods, in a tiny cabin. He didn't even have a driveway. At least not in winter. As soon as the snow began to pile up, he skied on or snowshoed his way home whenever he went anywhere, parking his truck at the end of the trail through the woods. Steve made his living as a carpenter, but in the late winter and early spring, he spent his time making maple syrup from the trees that surrounded his cabin. It must be about 10 years since I've come up here to help at sugaring time, Dad was saying now as he and Charles slogged their way up the snowy trail. But I'm sure nothing has changed. Steve still makes his syrup the old-fashioned way, all by hand. It's a lot of work, and he can always use help. Charles didn't know how much about making maple syrup, even though Dad had tried to explain it during their drive. He'd been too sleepy to pay attention to the details, but he knew the basics. At the end of winter, the sap in the maple trees start to rise. If you collect it and boil it down, you get maple syrup. Charles loves maple syrup. What was better than a plate of pancakes drowning in a golden brown puddle of sweetness? That was exactly what they'd had for breakfast that morning in the inn where they were staying. Charles' stomach rumbled just thinking about those pancakes. With all this hiking, his breakfast had already worn off, and his tummy was empty. "I'm hungry, Dad," he said. "We're almost there," Dad said. "Steve promised he would have some lunch already ready for us." "I didn't think it was going to be so snowy," Charles said, as he trudged through the soft, wet drifts. They were following Steve's well-packed snowshoe trail, but Charles still punched through his whole snowshoes, pushing down past the top layer of snow until he was in up to his knees on every third to fourth step. Each time it was a struggle to pull his snowshoes back out. He could feel the cold wetness soaking through his boots and into his socks. "I didn't either," Dad admitted. "Steve told me they'd gotten a lot of snow this year, but I figured most of it wouldn't be melted away by now. The way it is at home, I always forgot how much colder it was up here, and how much more snow they get, even at this time of the year." Steve says, "There's always at least one big storm in March." He stopped to catch his breath. "But look, isn't it beautiful?" He held out his arms and gazed all around. The bare trees, the shining snow, the bright blue sky, those puffy white clouds. Isn't so quiet. This is how I always remember Steve's woods." Charles looked around. Dad was right. It was beautiful. He liked the feeling of the cold snow beneath him and the warm sun above. "Is that a sap bucket?" he said. "We must be getting closer." Hanging from it was a silver bucket with a lid. The welcome tree. Dad said, "This is always the first one Steve taps." He showed Charles where the melting spout had been pushed in a small hole drilled into a tree. The bucket was hanging from the spout. "Hear that?" "What?" Charles asked. Dad put his fingers to his lips. "Listen," he said. Then Charles heard it. Plink, plink, plink. Droplets of sap were falling out of the spout and into a bucket. He grinned up at Dad. Dad smiled back. "That is the true sound of spring," he said. He slid back the bucket's lid to look inside. "Only an inch or two of sap is in there," he said. "Steve must have already emptied this one earlier this morning." "Is the sap sweet?" Charles asked. His mouth was dry, and he needed a drink. "Want to taste for yourself?" Dad reached in the bucket and scooped up a handful of sap for Charles to slurp. The sap was cold at first. Charles was disappointed because it tasted more like water than syrup. But then it hit his tongue with just a hint of sweetness. He smiled up at Dad. "Yum," he said, putting his own hand in for another scoop. "We can fill our water bottles later," Dad said, scooping up a handful for himself. "I remember now how we used to always drink the sap while we were working out here. Steve says it's a spring tonic, really good for you." "That's what Steve says, is it?" Charles whirled around to see who was talking. A tall, thin man with long gray hair tied back into a ponytail. "What?" Stood smiling at them, hands on hips. "Steve," said Dad. He stepped over to throw his arms around his friend. "Steve!" Steve gave him a big bear hug in return. "How'd you sneak up on us?" "I'm like a cat," Steve said, smiling. "Welcome. Thought you'd never make it, but here you are. And here's Charles all grown up." He stuck out his hand, and Charles shook it. "Last time I saw you, you were no bigger than a duckling." Charles laughed. He knew he'd been about as big as his young brother, the bean, was now, but it was still funny to be compared to a duckling. "How's Betsy and Lizzie?" Steve asked. Betsy and Charles was Charles' mom, and Lizzie was his older sister. "They're great," said Dad. "Betsy's working on a big newspaper story about our town's plan, becoming more energy efficient. And Lizzie, well, Lizzie's always busy with something, usually something to do with dogs. These days she's trying to teach our puppy Buddy how to dance, I think." Steve threw back his head and guffawed. "Dancing dogs? What's next? And are you still taking in all the little puppies of the world?" Dad laughed. "Well, we are still fostering puppies, but mostly one at a time." Buddy was one of our foster puppies, Charles told Steve. Charles was usually shy with new grown-ups, but Steve was so friendly. "He's the only one we kept forever." "He must be the best one then," said Steve. "He is," Charles said, thinking of his sweet brown puppy with the heart-shaped white spot on his chest. He would be so much fun to have Buddy along. But Lizzie had refused to let Charles and Dad take him. Charles felt his heart swell the way it did when he thought of Buddy. His fingers itched to pet Buddy's soft, warm tummy and ruffle his silky ears. Steve and Dad were still talking, and the little one, Steve, asked, Adam, right? Adam, right? We still call the bean. We still call him the bean, Dad said, the way we did when he was just a baby, and looked at like a he's fine and looks like a little lima bean when he was sleeping. He's fine too, always getting into mischief. Excellent, Steve said, clapping Dad on the shoulder. Glad to hear the family is thriving. I must say it's great to have you here, old friends. Are you two ready to haul some sap? Steve pointed to a pair of big blue plastic buckets. Plastic buckets. He'd sat down in the snow. The way it works is we empty the smaller metal buckets into these bigger buckets. Then we haul the big buckets to an even bigger tank just over the hill there and dump them in. He held up both arms in a muscle man pose. It's hard work, but it'll make you strong. How often do you have to do? Charles asked. Every day as long as the sap is running, said Steve, and whether the sap runs or not depends on the weather. I hear we've got a great streak coming up right now, with the nights under freezing and the days sunny and warm. That's what the trees love most. He gave the big tree next to them an affectionate slap. Don't you, pal? He asked. Charles smiled. Steve was what Mom would call a real character who talked to trees. Someone who lived among them, Charles guessed. Why shouldn't Steve make friends with his neighbors, even if they weren't people? Charles and Dad helped Steve empty a few buckets on their way to the sugar house, pouring the crystal clear sap into big blue buckets, and then hanging the silver buckets back on their taps. Charles spilled a little sap onto the snow while he was lifting a full bucket off its tap. But want to see something? Check out these animal tracks going across the snow. He knelt down to point out a trail of little paw prints. I'm thinking it's probably a fox, Steve said. I've seen these tracks all around my cabin lately. A fox? Charles asked. Really? They look like puppy tracks to me. Chapter 2. Steve sat back on his haunches and looked up at me. Charles, puppy tracks? Charles nodded. They look exactly like the tracks my puppy Buddy makes after a snowstorm. Well, after all, foxes are related to dogs, aren't they? Dad asked. So maybe. Steve held up a hand. You know, I think Charles might be right. When I look more closely, I can see that these tracks are rounder and a little bigger than a fox tracks. And see how the trail meanders? He pointed. It wanders all over the place. Here, there, and everywhere. Fox trails. Oh, I forgot. We are on chapter 2, by the way. Tend to move straight in one direction. Foxes are always on a mission. But what would a puppy be doing all the way out here in the woods? Charles asked, and Steve nodded. Right, you would expect that. You would expect that, he said, as a matter of fact. This reminds me that some of my neighbors have been talking about a young stray they've been seeing this winter. I saw my friend Adelaide at the office the other day, and she said she thought the pup had been living in her barn for a while. Maybe he's decided to drop in on me now. On me now. Wow, said Charles, but he spun around in a circle, almost falling over in his own snowshoes. Then he threw his arms out at the endless woods. Where would he be? He could be anywhere out here. Do you think he's okay? It's cold out, and he must be hungry. We have to try to find him and help him. Charles saw Steve look at Dad, with his eyebrows raised. Dad grinned and reached out to pat Charles on the back. That's my boy, he told Steve. Charles can't stand to see or even hear about a dog in trouble. Steve nodded seriously. You've got a big heart, Charles. Tell you what, we've got a few more buckets of sap to collect, and as soon as we're done, we'll see if we can find that puppy, okay? Reluctantly, Charles nodded. He did not want to wait 1 minute to look for the dog, but he wasn't in charge. He followed Dad and Steve for more puppy tracks in the snow. There, he stooped to take a closer look. Nope, these tracks were totally different. They were tinier, and he could see the mark of a tail that had been dragging along, plus these tracks led straight to a tree trunk, then disappeared as if the animal had climbed right up. Probably a squirrel, thought Charles. Dad and Steve had stopped up ahead in a small grove of trees. Charles could hear them talking as they emptied buckets. He looked back at the spot where he'd first seen the puppy tracks. Maybe he could follow the trail a little way and find out where the puppy had gone. He looked at Dad and Steve again. They picked up their blue buckets and began to hike slowly up the trail. Still talking, Dad was so busy catching up with his old friends that he hadn't even noticed that Charles wasn't with them. Charles didn't stop to think about it. He turned around on the trail and headed back to them, and back the way they'd come. When he got to the place where the puppy tracks crossed, he stooped down to take a closer look. Which way was the puppy headed? He could see the shape of puppy paws outlined perfectly in the new snow, right down to the toenails. It was clear that the dog had been headed toward a cluster of pine trees off to Charles' left. He stared into the dark, thick woods. Maybe the puppy was right over there, watching him. It would only take a minute or two to check. He looked back over his shoulder at Dad and Steve. They were still hiking slowly up the trail, still talking. Charles stepped off the snowshoe path and began to follow the tracks. Steve was right. The trail did mender heading this way, and that mender, Charles said under his breath as he followed the tracks. That was a new word for him. Amy. And it was a good one. Charles liked to put words like that into his back pocket and pulled them out in the middle of a conversation. He loved seeing the look of his mom's face when he did that. The other day, when Buddy was barking and running around the house, Charles had said that Buddy was being obstreperous. Mom had looked surprised, then burst out laughing. Charles smiled, remembering. Then he realized he'd lost the trail because he wasn't paying attention. He retraced his steps and picked it up again as the tracks meandered from the tree to tree. He even found the place where the puppy had peed against a tall pine. Just like Buddy, he said. Just like Buddy, he said aloud, thinking of the way his puppy always had to sniff every bush and tree before he picked out the one he wanted. Thinking of Mom and Buddy made Charles miss them both. They seemed very far away right then, as he stood alone in the middle of a snowy woods. Even Dad and Steve seemed pretty far away. Charles took a deep breath, which helped to undo the sudden lump in his throat, and kept walking. The way seemed darker than Charles entered the piney grove where the puppy's tracks led. He had to squint to see the trail and push heavy snow-laden branches out of his way in order to follow the tracks. Charles saw a spot where snow, maybe he'd smelled something interesting there, and then continued on. The tracks kept going, and Charles kept pushing forward until he popped out into a small clearing near a stone cliff that had moss growing all over it. Even now in winter, it was pretty the way melting snow trickled down the bright green moss and made it shine. But Charles knelt down and looked more closely to be sure. The tracks seemed to head directly for the cliff and then disappeared. A puppy couldn't walk straight up that steep rock face. There, where had he gone? As Charles knelt, he heard a tiny whimper. Then another. He peered along the bottom of the cliff until he spotted a great dark triangle where there was an opening in the rock. The tracks led right into it. "Hello," Charles said. He listened carefully and heard another soft whimper. He replied slowly. He crawled forward. "Puppy, are you in there?" Then he stopped, frozen in his tracks, wondering all of the sudden whether Steve had been right in the first place. Maybe those tracks really had been made by a fox, and maybe the fox was holed up in his little cave, just where a fox belongs. On the one hand, Charles thought he would really love to see a fox, a flash of red fur, and a long thick tail in the middle of these snowy piney woods. But on the other hand, were foxes nice, or were they scary? Did foxes bite? What would happen if a fox suddenly ran out of that tiny dark cave straight at Charles? Charles stood up quickly and turned to look over his shoulder. Which way should he run if that happened? Which way was out anyway? He could follow his own tracks, but then he'd be pushed pushing through the trees again. There must be an easier way back on the trail. The trail where were Dad and Steve. Hadn't they noticed by now that he wasn't with them? They were probably looking for him, at least. He hoped they were. He cleared his throat. Dad, he called, but his voice seemed very tiny. Dad, he called louder. He heard a tiny rustle and turned out around just in time to see a little brown and white face at the entrance to the small cave in the rocks. The face was framed with two long, floppy ears, one brown and one white and brown spots. Definitely not a fox. Charles' heart thumped in his chest, but he didn't move a muscle. He didn't want to scare the puppy, who was already looked frightened. Hi there, he said softly. The face disappeared. Charles waited, staying very still. The puppy popped out again. This time the puppy tilted his head in a questioning way, just like a buddy always did. Who are you? Should I be afraid? Yes, I think I will. Being afraid is always safer. Again the face disappeared, moving slowly. Charles squatted down. Come on, pal, he said softly. You don't have to worry. I won't hurt you. Charles thought of how Lizzie had once called him a puppy whisperer because he seemed to be able to connect with any puppy, no matter how scared or shy they were. He whisper this puppy out of its tiny hole and into his arms. He slid a hand into the pocket of his jeans, hoping to find at least a piece of a dog biscuit to tempt the puppy with nothing. He tried all his pockets, but they were empty. When he glanced back at the cave entrance, he saw the puppy was peering out again. His face was so cute, and a big brown spot surrounding one eye, and freckles on brown sprinkled all over. Charles held out his hands. Hey, Freckles, he whispered. Come on out. I don't have anything to give you, but I'm still a friend. Charles, a shout boomed behind him. Dad! Charles stood up and ran clomping through the snow on his snowshoes into his father's arms. What are you doing way back in the woods here? Dad asked. He looked a little mad at first, but then he knelt down to give Charles a huge hug. I thought we'd lost you, but now we found you, Steve said, coming up behind them. I followed those tracks, Charles blurted out the whole story. It was a puppy, a brown and white one. He's so cute, but he's really shy, and now he won't come out. He finished, pointing to the cave. No freckled face peered back at them. Would the grown-ups believe him? Nice tracking, said Steve, nodding, but I'm not surprised that this puppy is shy. He's been living on his own for a while. From what I hear, probably half wild by now. He dug into his jacket pocket. Still, I bet he might be tempted by something really good to eat. And I just happen to have a leftover turkey sandwich right here. Chapter 3. Guys, I'm going to close my door because it's so loud out there that I had to read so loud for you. Okay, now let's get started with Chapter 3. Steve unfolded the white paper around the sandwich, then lifted off a top piece of bread. So the turkey slice showed. This looks like something that might tempt a hungry pup. Hey, pup, hey. He held it out for Charles to take. Worth a try. Anyway, Charles peeled off a few slices of turkey. then walked closer to the little cave. Puppy, he called Freckles. You've already named him? Dad asked. Shh. Charles turned around with his finger to his lips. He's shy. He'll never come out if we keep talking. Dad frowned. Charles knew he shouldn't have shushed him, but he really wanted that dog to come out. Sorry, he mouthed. But Dad and, and but Dad nodded and waved a hand to let Charles know it was okay. He got it. He knew how much puppies meant to Charles. Charles squatted down, holding out a piece of turkey. He was hoping that the smell of meat would waft into the little cave. Into the little cave. Sure enough, after a few moments, he saw movement, and the little face appeared again. Hi, pup, said Charles. Want some? The puppy's nose twitched, but he didn't move. Are you sure he's friendly? Dad asked in a low voice. Charles waved a hand, meaning both. Yes, and be quiet. The face disappeared. Charles turned around. Dad, he said. Okay, said his father. I will be quiet. He pretended to zip his lips. Just don't get too close until we have a better idea of what this dog is like. Charles nodded and turned back to the cave. He waited patiently until the puppy's face reappeared. Then he pinched off a small piece of turkey and tossed it, hoping to get it closer to the puppy. It landed a foot from the cave entrance. The puppy's nose twitched again, but he didn't step forward. Charles saw him lick his lips. Aha, you're hungry, said Charles softly. I knew it. He tore off another piece and tossed it a little farther this time. It landed right in front of the puppy. The puppy's nose twitched. He licked his lips again. That smells so good. I'm scared to come out, but I can't resist. He bent to gobble it up. Then he cocked his head and looked straight at Charles as if asking for more. Yes! Charles said under his breath. He tossed another piece. This time the puppy didn't duck back into the cave. Instead, he gobbled the piece and stepped forward to grab the first scrap of turkey that Charles had thrown. Too. He tossed another piece a little way in front of the puppy. The puppy didn't move, and then he did. He took one step and stretched out his skinny neck and grabbed up the piece of meat. Then he stepped back. Charles sighed. This was going to take forever. To give them a stretch, the puppy disappeared back into his cave. Let me try for a while, said Steve. Charles handed over the turkey and went to stand by Dad, while Steve squatted down. Steve always had a way with animals. Dad told Charles in a low voice. He doesn't have any, but he's like you. He can't ignore an animal in need. He even helps out his farmer friends. Sometimes, when they have a baby animal who needs extra care, Dad put a hand on Charles' shoulder. Don't worry, he'll get the puppy out of there. They watched as Steve tossed piece after piece of turkey toward the cave entrance. The puppy appeared and began to snatch up the treats. Steve stayed very still and murmured things that Charles could barely hear. That's it, and okay, friends, and things like that. Soon, Steve was making shorter and shorter throws, and the puppy was coming closer. and closer to him. Charles held his breath. Now he could see how thin the puppy was and how he was shivering as he stood in the snow. Was he probably trembling with fright or from cold? Probably both. The little puppy, who had been living on his own all winter. All winter? What kind of wait? Probably both, thought Charles. His heart went out to the brave little pup who had been living on his own all winter. What kind of dog was Freckles anyway? Lizzie was the one who could always guess dog breeds. Any particular breed, more like a mix of several different types. He had never seen another dog quite like Freckles. Not even on Lizzie's Big Dogs Breeds of the World poster. But Charles loved the puppy's spots, his long ears, and his sweet face. I'm running out of turkey, Steve said, without turning his head. But I think I can almost grab him. Be ready if he runs past me, Charles watched closely as Steve threw one more piece of turkey very close to the tip of his own snowshoe. The puppy slowly crept closer, stopping to eye Steve every few seconds. Then, when he bent his head to take the meat, Steve swept out a long arm and grabbed him by the scruff of the neck. Got him, he said, pulling the puppy into his arms. Charles saw the puppy squirm and wriggle, but Steve held him calmly and firmly. And soon he settled down. Now what? Steve grinned up at Charles. Charles opened his mouth and closed it again. He hadn't really thought that far ahead. He looked at Dad. Well, we were about to do for a foster puppy, right? He asked. He had been a while since the Petersons had helped a puppy in need. Whoa! Dad held up his hands. Hold on there, he said. How can we do that? We're not home, remember? We're staying at an inn. I don't think they allow pets there. Charles looked back at the puppy, who had nestled into Steve's wool jacket. He could see even from where he stood that the puppy was still shivering. But we can't leave him in the woods, he said. Maybe we should go back home early. We can foster him there. Dad shook his head. Nope. We promised Steve we'd help him with sugaring, and I'm not going to go back out on that. Maybe there's an animal shelter around here that they can take him. Charles felt his heart sink. Some animal shelters were warm, welcoming places, but even so, they were not homes for puppies. Puppies needed homes, places where they could really feel safe and loved and cared for, especially scared, skinny puppies who weren't used to people. Charles looked at the little face peeking out from Steve's arms. Steve looked up, still cradling the puppy. I guess he'd have to bunk with me for a night or two while he figured it out. He said, I don't have much room, but at least my place stays warm, thanks to my wood stove. Charles grinned up at him. Really? That would be so great. He couldn't wait to get to know his puppy, to play with him, to find out where and how he liked to be petted, and what he'd like to eat. You'll have to help out, though, Steve said. I can't have him underfoot while I'm trying to gather sap and boil it up. This is a busy time for me. Of course, Charles said. Said Charles. He couldn't stop smiling as he followed Dad and Steve back through the pine grove and down the trail to Steve's cabin. Everything was working out perfectly. It turned out that the cabin was very nearby, just over the hill. That's where the boil the sap. Boil the sap. Steve said, gesturing to a small shed with a metal stovepipe sticking up from its roof. I'll show you all that later. He led them to a little log cabin behind the shed and pushed open a door with his foot as he carried the puppy inside. Welcome, he said as he waved Charles and Dad in. It's so cozy, Charles burst out. The cabin was warm and smelled like a wood smoke. It was mainly one big room with windows all around. There was a tiny kitchen along one wall and a big comfy-looking couch. Along another, a ladder led to a sleeping loft above the couch. The other two walls were covered in bookshelves. Stacks of books filled every horizontal surface. A rocking chair sat next to a shiny blue wood stove and pumped out waves of heat. Charles could just picture Steve sitting in that chair on a quiet winter evening, reading as he rocked back and forth. Cozy for sure, said Steve. Some folks think it's awfully small, but it seems to fit me just fine. I like it, said Charles, but his mind was on Freckles. Do you have something we can use to make a bed for the puppy? Sure, said Steve. Why don't you grab those old towels hanging on a hook behind the door? There, Steve was still holding Freckles in his arms, and he jutted on a hook behind the door arms, and he jutted his chin to show Charles where to go. Charles could see that the dog's eyelids were drooping, and he could tell that the exhausted puppy was about to fall asleep. He was dying to pet the dog, but first he wanted to make sure that Freckles would be comfortable. He ran from the towels. Steve told him to put them on the floor near the wood stove and add a couple of those pillows from the couch too. He said, let's make him comfy. The poor little dude has been living rough. While Charles set up a little bed for Freckles, Steve told Dad where to find some bowls for water and food, and I guess he'll just have to eat leftovers tonight, Steve said, and I'm sure he'll be happy for them. I'll pick up a bag of food when I go to town for the mail tomorrow. Steve knelt on the floor to settle Freckles onto the towels. There you go, he said. You rest for a while. Charles knelt down too. The puppy looked up at him with sad golden brown eyes, and Charles could see that he was still trembling. Think I can pet him? He asked Steve. He still seems pretty scared. Steve said, but if you're gentle, he might tell you. He might let you. Charles reached out a hand slowly. Freckles drew his head back and ducked out of the way. Charles tried not to let it hurt his feelings. It's okay, Freckles, he said softly. I know you're scared, but soon you'll figure out that I'm your friend. Charles hoped he was right, but meanwhile he could see that Freckles and found the perfect peaceful place to spend a few nights. Chapter 4, guys. So guys, we're going to end this video right here, and I hope you have a great Christmas and a happy new year. And don't forget to smash that like button and smash that subscribe button with a hammer and until your device breaks. Okay, guys? And comment all down below before you smash that like button and subscribe button. And so, guys, we are gonna continue with Fluffy and Freckles later in the book. I don't even know if Fluffy's gonna come. I think Fluffy's gonna come later in the story. And guys, I hope you have a great day and a great Christmas break. Bye. See you next